Hey everyone, and welcome to This Explainer. I am so excited you're here today because we're going to deconstruct something that affects, well, absolutely every single one of us. We're going to take a really close look at that exhausting rat race that so many of us find ourselves trapped in, often without even realizing it. We live in a world that has essentially terraformed the digital landscape into this giant industrial factory for the ego. We spend our days hunting for that fleeting dopamine hit of a notification, or obsessing over some inflated vanity title, like being named the assistant to the regional manager, or buying into really expensive luxury symbols just to prove to everyone that we've made it. But what if the world's absolutely most popular goal is actually just a rigged game?
I want you to start by just asking yourself this. Why does getting what we want feel so empty sometimes? Seriously, think about your own life for a second. Have you ever chased a promotion, maybe a certain follower count, or getting into a specific social circle, completely and utterly convinced that once you got there, you'd finally feel respected, you'd finally feel secure? But then, you arrive, and the peak is surprisingly hollow. Climbing that ladder of prestige almost inevitably leads to this empty summit. It leaves us with a brief sugar rush and then right back to the exact same underlying hunger. So today, we're going to use our source material to break down exactly why this happens, and more importantly, how we can actually step off this treadmill.
Okay, let's dive right into this. Section 1. The illusion of status, a borrowed asset.
We really need to start by understanding why this societal promise of status is just fundamentally flawed from the get-go. Status is entirely relational. It has absolutely no intrinsic weight on its own. It exists solely in the minds of others. So what does this actually mean in practice? Well, it means status is a borrowed asset. It's essentially a leaky container. When you make prestige your primary objective in life, you are dangerously outsourcing your entire self-worth to an audience that is, frankly, fickle, highly distracted, and constantly changing its standards. You are literally handing the keys to your happiness over to a jury that you have zero control over, a jury that can just revoke your value without any notice whatsoever.
And because it lives entirely in other people's heads, status is incredibly context-dependent. It's fragile. You might be an absolute titan of industry in the boardroom, right? Commanding total respect from your entire staff. But then you leave the office and you are utterly anonymous at the school gate while picking up your kids. Or you're a total stranger the second you step into a different cultural zip code. Status just doesn't travel well. And because of that, the pursuit of it breeds this perpetual underlying anxiety. I mean, it can evaporate overnight due to a single mistake, a sudden market shift, or honestly, just a random change in cultural tastes.
Moving on to Section 2, the maintenance tax, the cost of the illusion.
Now, if you've been feeling exhausted lately, this might just give you the exact vocabulary for why you feel that way. Maintaining a high-status facade carries a staggering maintenance tax that most people completely fail to calculate until they are practically bankrupt of time and energy. Think about it. It requires constant impression management. You're curating your digital persona, you're worrying about your wardrobe, you're making sure you're seen at all the right events. The cognitive load of all that is just enormous. And here's the real tragedy of it all. Every single hour you spend signaling your competence to a crowd is an hour stolen from actually cultivating that competence. It distracts you from the one thing, that deep, meaningful craft and work that actually provides real, lasting satisfaction.
It creates a life that literally feels like a permanent audition with no closing night. Just imagine the relentless performative burden of that. It's utterly exhausting. And it's exactly why high-status people so often report having intense imposter syndrome. Because the higher you climb, the more you have to lose. Your mental energy shifts away from actually enjoying your position, and instead you're just desperately trying to protect it.
Which brings us to Section 3, the moving goalpost, a zero-sum treadmill.
So, we are dealing with a massive evolutionary mismatch here. Our ancient brains are hardwired to crave social rank for survival. But we've taken those ancient brains and dropped them into a modern digital world of infinite comparison, and this creates a relentless hedonic treadmill. Here's how it works. You achieve a new rank or title, and boom, you get a brief dopamine rush. But almost instantly, your peer group shifts. Through hedonic adaptation, that brand new level just becomes your normal baseline. Instinctively, your gaze drifts up to the elite group on the next rung of the ladder, envy sets in, and the whole cycle repeats itself. You just find yourself at the bottom of a new, way more expensive ladder, feeling perpetually dissatisfied. The finish line? It's a total illusion.
Now, what's really interesting about this slide is that it shows the darkest mechanic of this entire game. Status is what economists call a positional good, meaning it is strictly zero-sum. For your rank to actually mean anything, someone else has to be below you. You can't just expand the total supply of status. If everyone suddenly gets a better car or a fancier title, your relative position stays exactly the same. So your gain is quite literally someone else's loss. And that creates this toxic environment, where the very concept of having enough is just a mathematical impossibility.
All right, let's look at Section 4, Hype versus Reality, the human experience.
When we take a step back and measure what society promises us against the documented reality of the human experience, we find this massive glaring gap. Society hypes up this idea that high status brings universal respect and absolute security. But reality? Reality shows us that true respect comes from character, and status is actually incredibly fragile. We're promised that prestige is going to equal joy, and that it's going to secure our legacy. Yet we find over and over that real joy actually stems from deep, meaningful bonds. And it's our values that outlast us, not our fancy job titles. What about all that external validation we endlessly chase? Yeah? It turns out to be entirely hollow and highly addictive, rather than actually sustaining us.
And this gap between the hype and the reality is especially clear, and honestly, quite painful when it comes to our relationships. Achieving high status frequently results in this phenomenon called golden isolation. Think about it. When you lead with your rank, or your title, or your wealth, you're basically inviting people to interact with your persona rather than the actual you. It creates these shallow, highly transactional relationships. It gets to the point where it's nearly impossible to tell who genuinely likes you and who just likes your position. And as so many high-status folks eventually painfully discover, the exact moment you strip that title away, those transactional relationships just evaporate into thin air. True connection requires vulnerability and equality, and the status game actively suppresses both of those things.
Which leads us to maybe the most painful price of all. Authenticity is the ultimate opportunity cost here. The relentless pursuit of public applause absolutely demands conformity. It forces you to shave off your unique quirks, your weird little interests, and your natural instincts, all just to fit the values of whatever hierarchy you've chosen. Over time, you kind of stop being an actual complex person, and you become this curated template. You end up trading your genuine self for a standardized, high-status facade. And that is a heavy price to pay.
But listen, it's not all doom and gloom. Section 5. Building on bedrock, sustainable alternatives. It really doesn't have to be this way. I want to give you permission right here, right now, to just step off that exhausting treadmill and find some durable fulfillment. So the crucial point is that true peace comes from unbreakable foundations. It comes from internal mastery, like truly knowing who you are when you are completely alone in a room. It comes from competence, from being able to solve problems without needing an audience cheering you on, and from fostering authentic connections rooted in actual mutual trust. When you build your life on these internal metrics, status just becomes this quiet, pleasant byproduct of living well, rather than the desperate, exhausting target of all your efforts. Because unlike borrowed status, which, remember, exists entirely in the fickle minds of other people, your character and your competence belong entirely to you. They are incredibly robust assets. They survive market shifts, they survive company reorganizations, they survive cultural changes, and yes, even scandals. Building your life on actual skill and virtue means you're building on solid rock rather than the constantly shifting sands of public perception.
I want to leave you with a final thought to really reflect on today. Look past the fancy titles, look past the follower counts and the luxury symbols, and ask yourself arguably the most consequential question of all. What would you continue to pursue if the audience completely vanished tomorrow? The answer to that question reveals the only bedrock that's actually worth building your life upon. Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer. I really hope this helps you step off that treadmill and start building something real. Catch you next time.